Hi, I'm Portable Orange, call me Port. I've come across quite a few history channels on YouTube that are really just retelling the stories that the ancient historians have passed on to us. The problem is, the historians that have survived to us are just the ones everyone enjoyed reading and decided to copy. In my last video, I mentioned how many of the ancient historians who wrote about Nero mentioned that there were plenty of positive accounts of Nero's reign. However, none of them survived to us, likely because of the suppression of those stories after Nero's death. This isn't incredibly surprising, as the vast majority of ancient Roman writing has been lost to us forever. However, the fragments of history that have survived to us often disagree with each other, sometimes about fairly major details. Just as an example, the famous story of Nero singing while Rome burned comes from the Roman historian Suetonius. But another historian, writing around the same time as Suetonius, named Tacitus, claims that Nero didn't burn Rome down at all. There is other evidence we can examine, of course, coinage and architecture being some of my favorites. And sometimes those historians whose works are lost will get quoted by later historians whose works have survived to us, thereby indirectly preserving fragments of those lost works. But what frustrates me is how many people ignore the pitfalls of blindly trusting these ancient sources to be 100% accurate. And to illustrate that point, let's take a look at a different story from the Roman Republic, about the Brothers Gracchi. The Brothers Gracchi were famous and divisive figures in the Roman Republic, operating from about 150 BC to about 120 BC. The Gracchi brothers came from a fairly noble lineage. Their father had been a fairly successful senator, but their grandfather had defeated Hannibal, single-handedly winning the Punic Wars for Rome and establishing their command over the Mediterranean. The elder brother, Tiberius, also began his career in the military, which was the common way to get into politics back in the day. He first served in the Third Punic War under Scipio Aemilianus, and had quite a bit of success there. His next campaign, where he served under Gaius Hostilius Mancinius, was less successful. They were attempting to take land in Spain from a group of people known as the Numenites. However, they failed and were defeated quite humiliatingly. With all of his men surrounded, Mancinius told Tiberius to go out and negotiate a truce, which Tiberius then did. This would really begin his loss of popularity with the elite class, though, as when he brought the treaty back to the Senate for them to ratify, they outright rejected it, hating it and seeing it as incredibly unfavorable to Rome. In fact, they were so upset they actually sent Mancinius bound and naked to the Numenites for them to do with as they pleased. However, the Numenites, possibly because they respected Mancinius, refused to accept him, allowing Mancinius to just return home and live out the rest of his days in his villa, where he had a statue of himself commissioned where he was naked and bound, and he displayed it publicly to show his devotion to the Roman people. Based. Now, it had been proposed that Tiberius be delivered to the Numenites in a similar fashion. However, Tiberius' soldiers spoke up for him, saying that he had acted quite heroically on the battlefield and saved many of their lives, and therefore the Senate decided against it. However, they were already kind of soured on Tiberius at this time, even though the plebeians seemed to like him. Cicero, writing decades later, would explain why. Cicero states, "Here then you have the origin of the tyrant, for that is the title given by the Greeks to an unjust king. Several men in the past attempted to win the kingship, and recently Tiberius Gracchus." Now, Tiberius was mostly called a tyrant due to his land reforms, so let me try and set the stage real quick. Tiberius was never able to be appointed senator, instead running for tribune of the plebs, which was an elected position. So the plebs did seem to like him in at least some capacity. In a future video, I'm going to examine this period of Roman history a little more, but to sum up a very complicated political landscape, through all these wars, Rome had essentially won a bunch of new land, and this land was deemed public land, meaning anyone could just go onto it and start a farm or do whatever they wanted with it. However, rather than a bunch of small farms cropping up, the senatorial class had basically swooped in and established these huge mega farms in this land. These farms were mostly worked by slaves, and because the price of the produce that they could push out was so much cheaper than those of the small subsistence farmers, a lot of those small farms were then also bought up by the senators and driven out of business. With small farms being unsustainable, the Roman countryside became almost deserted. The senatorial class spent their time in Rome, so really it was just slaves and taskmasters out in the countryside. Pretty much everyone agreed this was a problem that needed fixing. I mean, culturally, the small farmer was seen as the embodiment of Roman virtue. Hard work, dedication and piety. But to show that politics has been exactly the same for the past 2,000 years, everyone could agree there was a problem, but no one could agree on how to solve it. Tiberius' proposed land reform would have limited the amount of public land anyone could control to 300 acres. This would have been great for the Roman economy, and especially the plebeian class, but it would have really hurt the senatorial class, who, remember, controlled these large mega farms at the time. Now, the Senate decided to play a nasty trick in that they actually did pass Tiberius' bill, but then they refused to pass any funding for the survey. You see, in order to enforce a law like this, someone needed to go out and survey the land and see how many acres each person was operating on. Tiberius, however, was not so easily put aside. When a client king of Rome left a lot of his fortune to the public treasury of Rome, essentially, Tiberius said, well, why don't we use this to fund the survey team? But still, the Senate turned against it, spreading rumors that Tiberius was planning to pocket the money for himself and that the survey wouldn't happen anyway. Now, Tiberius tried to defend himself, of course, but they brought lawsuits against him and tried to censure him and really just tried to run down the clock. Because you see, Tiberius's term was almost up, and the senators figured that they could just fund his opponent and make sure the plebeians would vote for someone who wasn't Tiberius. Tiberius wasn't a dumb guy, so he knew something like this was likely going to happen. So on the day of the election, he took his men into the Capitoline Hill where the voting took place and essentially said, hey, we're going to oversee this vote and make sure that it's done properly. This alarmed the Senate, who thought he was going to rig the vote himself, and so they whipped up a mob by saying they needed to depose a tyrant, marched on the Capitoline Hill, and attacked Tiberius and his men, who did not fight back. Tiberius died that day, and his body was unceremoniously thrown into the Tiber River. However, the people truly mourned his death. They saw him as one of the few people in the Senate who was really fighting for the rights of these lower-class people. And eventually, there was such an outpouring of support, the Senate had no option but to fund this survey. It's just a shame Tiberius would never get to see his dream carried out. Good story, right? Well, about half of it might be true. Everything I just told you basically comes from the accounts of Plutarch and Appian. Plutarch and Appian were both writing in basically the same era, during the reign of the 5 good emperors. Living under the golden age of the empire, they had a lot of incentive to paint the Senate as essentially this bureaucratic nightmare that really just needed a strong man to come along and make decisions that would better the Roman people without all the need for all this red tape. However, we have other summaries of this account from people like Livy and Cicero. Livy grew up during the civil wars of Julius Caesar, so it's likely he still grew up hearing of the glory days of the Republic, but could see some of the inefficiencies that the Senate had. Livy goes out of his way to provide census numbers, showing that the population in the rural areas, far from declining, was actually growing. And Cicero points out that this public land Tiberius wanted to use had mostly been seized from tribes that were now allies of Rome. And these allies were essentially just allowed to work the land that had been theirs to begin with. Although it was sort of a handshake deal, there was nothing official. So Tiberius was probably just covering up for this earlier mistake. He'd found that the only way to power was essentially being elected by the plebeian class, and he thought the best way to do that was to invent problems and then promise to solve them, even though it wouldn't really have done much for them. But then is that right, though? Because after he died, those land reforms were actually passed. That's a thing that happened, and most people do speak of them as actually being okay. So which version is correct? Well, to appease all the centrists out there, the truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. Now, the Roman economy was suffering around that time. We know this because there was a rebellion going on in Sicily that was heavily pushing up grain prices across the empire. No, not that rebellion. That one came later. Yeah, that one. Yeah. Sicily and Italy did not like each other too much at that time. This economic slowdown likely did push people to migrate to the cities, as that's kind of what happens. You know, if you can't live on the farm, you pack up and move to the city because the promise is that there's more money to be made in the city than out in the farmlands. Struggling economy means less tax revenue, which means that there was less public work spending, meaning that those people moving to the city looking for work weren't able to find it. So there was an economic slowdown, and it did seem to be hitting the plebeian class worse than the others. There's also an interesting theory I heard that the increase in population, which led to a higher demand for food, led to an increase in the price of food, because with the rebellion in Sicily, there was less of a supply for it. And therefore, a lot of the farmland these people wanted was farmland around these large urban areas. However, because of this, most of the small farmers who did own that land had sold it off to the senatorial and richer classes, though this land notably was private land. This was not public land, and so wouldn't have been touched by Tiberius's law. It's an interesting theory, but I couldn't find a ton to back it up, so I'll just link where I got it from, and you can read it for yourself if that interests you. So taking all of this into account, it seems we can paint a far more nuanced picture. Tiberius was embarrassed by the treaty he negotiated, but it didn't seem to kill his career outright. He was able to find some popularity with the plebeian class and did champion some of their causes, as they were struggling at this time. It's just possible that his solution might not have been the best one. At the same time, some of the concerns of the Senate did seem to be legitimate. Should they really be spending this extra money on a land survey that probably wouldn't fix any of the economic problems when the economy was already doing so poorly? Most of the farmland the plebs wanted, those close to the urban centers, probably weren't even available. And the ones that were available in the public land was already being managed by Rome's allies. And starting a fight with your allies when you already have a shrinking army and economic troubles is just not a good move. In addition, Tiberius almost definitely overstepped when he took over the election. While, yes, you could look at it and say, no, he was definitely just gonna, do the right thing and make sure the vote was accurate. We don't know that. And the Senate wouldn't have known that either. So I don't think it's unreasonable that they then took the action they took, although killing him might have been a step too far. Ultimately, how much you want to lean into the embarrassed tyrant or the champion of the people story is going to come down to your personal interpretation of the historical records that we have. But the story, and the differing stories the ancient sources tell, doesn't end there, because after Tiberius's death, his younger brother, Gaius Gracchus, also had a career in Roman politics. Gaius was Tiberius's younger brother, and for our purposes, he enters this story when he's appointed to Tiberius's Land Reform Commission. He was later elected to be quaestor of Sardinia and served under Lucius Orestes there, trying to put down a rebellion. In this position, he won the respect of his troops by providing them rations when the Senate had denied the expense, thereby also winning the appreciation of the common man, similarly to how his brother had won the respect of his troops in the Numanite War. Noticing a pattern yet. At the end of this term, his role was extended as the rebellion was still ongoing. But Gaius, notably, left Sardinia and returned to Rome, without the approval of the Senate or his commanding officer. Plutarch argues that his appointment was only extended because the Senate was growing afraid of Gaius's power. However, most other historians agree this couldn't have been the case, as the rebellion would continue for another 2 years, and Orestes would stay and finish the fight. Just like his brother, Gaius was called in front of the Senate to defend his actions. Yet they would end up acquitting him. If the Senate was so scared of his power, why let him go when there's a clear legal case against him? He was then elected tribune of the plebs, again paralleling his brother, and, according to Plutarch, pushed a slew of legislation that supported the commoners, but that the Senate really didn't like. One of the specific laws he put forward is a point of contention between Livy and Plutarch again. Sadly, for this period, Livy's work is not extant entirely. There are only fragments and summaries that we can read by later writers. So we don't have quite as much to go on here as we did with Tiberius, but this is one of the points again where they disagree over a very important detail. Plutarch claimed Gaius wanted to add 300 equestrians to the Senate, which was currently made up of senators. Shocking, I know. And let both classes serve as judges. Importantly, at this point, the Senate was made up of the patrician class, or the highest social class in Rome. The equestrians were the second highest social class in Rome. This was a real threat to the patricians' power, who up until now had had complete control of the judicial system in the Roman Republic. Plutarch claims this was clearly to curtail the power of the Senate, and when arguing his case, Gaius actually turned away from the senators, facing the rest of the forum to make his argument, turning his backs, both metaphorically and literally, on the patricians who had ruled Rome up to this point. This is painted as a good thing, and the law is eventually passed by the assemblies, with Gaius even being afforded the power of choosing which equestrians would join the Senate. Plutarch even admits this power was almost monarchical in nature. Plutarch goes on to say the Senate actually seemed cool with this and ended up listening to Gaius's counsel on many issues that would come up down the line. Livy, who again we only have a summary from, claims instead that Gaius was trying to add 600 equestrians to the ranks of the Senate. thereby actually outnumbering the patricians within the Senate, ensuring that the equestrians would have total control of it. And Gaius being able to select those equestrians essentially means that the control of the Senate would be given over to him. So again, two radically different stories about what happened in this instance. Gaius becomes so popular with the assemblies that he basically can ask for anything he wants, and at one point asks for them to elect his friend as consul, which they do, and then his friend and the Senate turn on him. If that felt jarring, I'm right there with you. That's literally how Plutarch tells the story, though. Just he got his friend elected, and then immediately the Senate and his friend turn on him. And there's no real explanation given as to why that happened. As a result, Gaius continues to try and court the people's favor to hold on to his power, but the Senate pulls a sneaky and decides to court the people's favor harder than Gaius is even doing. During this time, Gaius also proposed a bill to extend the right of voting to non-citizens. This was wildly unpopular and immediately voted down, showing the populace was turning away from Gaius and back towards the Senate. Now, this only comes from Plutarch, and it's easy to look at this as Gaius just, again, trying to be magnanimous and extending rights to all peoples in Rome. However, it's also pretty easy to read this as Gaius realizes his power is slipping and so seeks to just increase the voter base by people who would be loyal to him because he gave them the vote. There's also a weird moment that happens later where the Senate decrees that all non-citizens have to leave Rome before the vote happens, and Tiberius puts out his own decree that says he'll protect anyone who disobeys this law, but then he walks by a non-citizen getting deported from Rome, and he doesn't do anything about it. Plutarch bends over backwards to protect Gaius here, saying that he feared not being able to prevent this man's deportation, thereby showing his own waning power. Or he was afraid of starting a direct conflict with the Senate because he believed that would bring about more strife. But either way, it's still not very champion of the people-like. Gaius continued to piss the Senate off in a rather funny story. There was a gladiator game being held, and the Senate decided to construct these big wooden seats so that they could see the game better and charge people to use those seats. And Gaius said, well, that's not fair, because then everyone sitting behind those seats won't be able to see unless they can pay. And the Senate said, well, too bad, we're keeping the seats. So Gaius just gets a bunch of guys together and they go in the middle of the night and tear the seats down, which that's just not going to help you out with the Senate. Like, I see where he's coming from, but if I was the Senate, I'd be pissed too. This did nothing to help his waning popularity, and at the next election, he was not voted tribune. Though Plutarch claims he actually did have enough votes. It was just that the Senate interfered with the votes to make it look like he hadn't won and then gave it to the other guy. But again, this is just Plutarch's claim, and no one really believes them, and none of this is at all a parallel for anything in modern politics. Though Gaius fell out of official power, he still had quite a lot of sway and quite a lot of fans among the Roman populace, and a lot of them would still take to the forum and sort of protest the current regime. In fact, when one of Gaius's enemies, consul at the time, was offering a sacrifice in the forum, one of his attendants told Gaius's supporters in the forum to move, either through a snide remark saying, make way for an honest citizen, implying they weren't, or through doing the Roman equivalent of flipping them the bird. He was immediately killed by the mob. Now, supposedly Gaius immediately condemned this action and was quite upset with his supporters, saying, why have you basically given them the ammunition they've been looking for all these years? But the fact still remains that it happened. The Senate called a meeting and demanded Gaius's head, even putting a price on it. He and his supporters took over the Aventine Hill, which was the hill in Rome that housed the gods that were worshipped mostly by the lower classes of people. And he would fulfill paralleling his brother when he was later killed. So again, two different versions of the story. Was Gaius a champion of the people? If so, why didn't he help that one guy being deported, even if it was going to cost him dearly? The tyranny story presented by Livy also seems questionable, as he was elected tribune several times, and the Senate didn't pursue legal action against him when they had him dead to rights. Now, you can go full conspiracy brain and assume that the Senate was terrified of him until they weren't, and that maybe even the mob in the forum was actually just a bunch of plants pretending to be Gaius's fans. But there's really no evidence for that. So again, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Gaius likely was popular with the lower classes, and potentially even with the Senate, at the start at least. But as he got comfortable with power, he tried to do too much too quickly. And when his ideas weren't exciting the populace anymore, and the Senate was doing his strategy of appealing to them already, he started to get scared. He pushed for a law trying to allow non-citizens to vote just to hold on to his power. And when he eventually lost it, his supporters turned violent. And it's not the weirdest thing for the Senate to get terrified that there's a guy in the city who has supporters so loyal to him, they will kill a man over a snide remark or a rude gesture. This story, by the way, is often presented as a prelude to the story of Caesar, and there are a lot of similarities. A populist man coming to power with a die-hard group of supporters under him, and the Senate trying to do everything they can to prevent him from seizing ultimate power. But this gets to my point. Most people don't research the Brothers Gracchi, but if you have heard about them, it's probably through a YouTube video like from the BBC or Extra History, both of which paint these brothers in an incredibly positive light, ignoring the evidence against them. No one I've seen walks this middle ground, talking about how they probably did some good, they probably did some bad, but they weren't heroes and they weren't monsters. They were just people. These stories have many sides to them, not just in modern interpretation, but even in the ancient historians' retelling. So something to keep in mind when you're learning about history is to try and view all of it as part of a larger picture. Every person you learn about in history, whether or not you know their name, was a person with hopes and dreams who lived an entire life just like you and me. They probably weren't crazy monsters, and they probably weren't great heroes, with maybe a couple exceptions in more modern history. This doesn't mean that the ancient historians are all useless, but their excellence comes in relation to other writings and evidence that we have. They're great in that they tell us the story in narrative form. We don't have to build the pieces together ourselves. However, we can't just take what they say as gospel. We have to look at what might make sense around it. And if we can glean some of their prejudices or look at contrary evidence, we can actually get a much more well-rounded picture. Also, if you look at the events surrounding this, the land reforms were eventually passed, and the fact that some later historians would remember these brothers so fondly shows that clearly they weren't all bad. And the fact that other later historians would remember them poorly shows that some of what they did was not looked upon favorably. I usually get suspicious if someone goes mad with power and faces zero repercussions until they're just killed out of the blue. Try to draw parallels to modern history if you can as well. The ancient people weren't an alien race. They were people who made decisions in much the same way we make decisions today. Think, too, of modern conflicts. Regardless of your opinions on Putin, he clearly does not hold power without respecting the populace's opinion at all. Otherwise, his conscriptions would have gone down very differently. He can't just disregard the opinions of the people under him, or even those of his military contractors. So hopefully next time you hear that Nero burned down Rome, or that Caligula married his sister, or that Ridley Scott is a historian, you can take a second and look around for anything that might back that up or cast doubt on those claims. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one. Short and sweet, and there's a reason for that. This was actually originally part of my Nero video, which I ended up cutting because I figured why spend 20 minutes before I get into Nero talking about someone completely unrelated to him. I'm still working really hard on the Christian syncretism video, but it is a lot of reading. Unlike my other videos, there's literally zero framework to go forward. I am just reading as much as I can, so I'm not even going to try and give an estimate on that. But I promise it will be out at some point. I'm just not going to promise when. But when I pulled this out of the Nero video, there was a part of me that thought, yeah, I could almost kind of turn this into a video on its own. So here it is. Hope you enjoyed. And if you did, maybe I can do stuff like this more in the future so that you don't have to wait so long in between my massive video essay dumps. So let me know in the comments if you like this, or if you hated it, or if you hate me, or if you like me. And I will not respond.